Karen Simmons strutted down the pristine sidewalks of Maplewood Estates, her heels clicking with purpose. She had lived here for 10 years, served on the HOA board for 5, and made it her personal mission to uphold the neighborhood's standards, whether people liked it or not. No untrimmed hedges, no out-of-season wreaths, and certainly no loitering. So when she spotted a scruffy-looking man sitting on the front steps of 108 Birchwood Drive, her stomach twisted in irritation. The house had been empty for months, ever since the previous owner passed away, and Karen had been working with the HOA to get it sold. A homeless person squatting there? Absolutely unacceptable. She narrowed her eyes, taking in his unshaven face, the worn-out hoodie draped over his thin frame, and the battered backpack sitting beside him. His sneakers were scuffed, and his jeans looked like they had seen better days, if they had ever seen good ones at all. Disgusted, Karen pulled out her phone and took a picture. Evidence, in case anyone in the HOA needed convincing that she was doing her duty. The man barely seemed to notice her, his head tilted up toward the sky as if he were lost in thought. Karen scoffed and marched closer. "Excuse me," she called, her voice laced with authority. "You can't sit here." The man turned his head slowly, his dark brown eyes meeting hers with a calmness that unsettled her. "I'm just sitting," he said. His voice was deep but even, as if he wasn't fazed by her presence at all. Karen folded her arms. "This is private property. You don't belong here." The man studied her for a long moment before nodding slightly. "I appreciate your concern," he said, then turned his gaze back toward the house as if she had already stopped existing. That infuriated her. Who did he think he was, acting like he had a right to ignore her? Her fingers tightened around her phone as she took another step forward. "I'm calling the police," he sighed, rubbing his forehead. "That's really not necessary." "Oh, it absolutely is," she snapped, her fingers already dialing 911. She lifted the phone to her ear, glancing around to make sure her neighbors saw her taking action. A few people were outside tending to their gardens or walking their dogs. If she was lucky, someone would mention her swift response at the next HOA meeting. 911, what's your emergency? "This is Karen Simmons from the Maplewood Estates HOA. There's a vagrant trespassing at 108 Birchwood Drive. He's sitting on the steps like he owns the place and he refuses to leave." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "Is he being aggressive?" Karen hesitated. The man hadn't done anything aggressive yet. But the way he was sitting there, so casual, so unaffected by her presence, made her uneasy. "Not yet," she said, "but you never know with these types." "We'll send officers to check it out," the dispatcher assured her. Karen smirked. "Good." She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket, satisfied. The police would handle this. The man would be gone soon, and Maplewood Estates would return to the picture-perfect neighborhood it was meant to be. As she stood there, waiting, she watched the man lean back against the steps, completely unconcerned. That smug indifference sent another wave of irritation through her. He didn't even look worried. Well, he would be soon enough. The police arrived faster than Karen expected. 2 squad cars rolled up, their lights flashing but sirens off. She stood on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, exuding the confidence of a woman who knew she was in the right. One of the officers, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, stepped out of his car and adjusted his belt. "Ma'am, you the one who called?" "Yes," Karen said, her voice firm. She pointed toward the man still sitting on the steps of 108 Birchwood Drive. "That's him. He's trespassing on private property." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger woman with a no-nonsense expression. They approached the man, who made no move to stand. He simply looked up at them with mild interest, as if they had just interrupted a peaceful afternoon. "Sir," the older officer said, "we got a report that you're trespassing." "Do you live here?" The man exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together as if considering his words. "I do, actually." Karen let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, please," she said. "I know for a fact that no one lives here. The house has been vacant for months." The officer held up a hand to quiet her, keeping his focus on the man. "Do you have any ID on you, sir?" The man nodded and reached into his backpack, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He flipped it open and handed over a driver's license. The officer took it, examining it carefully, his expression unreadable. Karen tapped her foot impatiently. "Well?" she demanded. "Can we get him out of here now?" The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out a small notepad and jotted something down before glancing back at the man. "Your name is Jordan Matthews?" "That's right." Karen froze. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't immediately place it. The officer continued, his tone shifting slightly. "And you're saying you own this property?" Jordan nodded. "I inherited it." Karen's scoff was automatic. "That's impossible," she said. "The last owner was—" She stopped mid-sentence, her mind catching up. The last owner had been a man named Samuel Matthews. Her stomach twisted. The officer gave Karen a measured look before turning back to Jordan. "Samuel Matthews was my father." Jordan's voice was calm, but there was something heavy underneath it, something that made Karen's confidence waver. The younger officer, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "We're going to need to verify this," she said, her tone professional but far less accusing than Karen had hoped. "Do you have any documentation of the property transfer?" Jordan nodded. "It's inside. I can show you." Karen's face burned. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. The police were supposed to arrest him, not entertain his claims. The officers exchanged another glance before the older one said, "All right, let's take a look." Karen followed as they all walked up the steps. She wasn't about to let this man pull some scam in her neighborhood. But the uneasy feeling in her gut only grew stronger. Something told her she had just made a huge mistake. Jordan stood up slowly, stretching his back before fishing out a set of keys from his pocket. Karen's eyes widened. Keys? That didn't make sense. How could a homeless man have keys to a house that had been sitting empty for months? She watched as he fit one into the front door's lock. It turned smoothly, and with a quiet click, the door swung open. Karen's stomach twisted. The officers followed him inside, and despite herself, Karen trailed after them, her curiosity outweighing her frustration. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of dust and time, but it was clear the place wasn't abandoned. A modest living space had been set up in the front room. An old couch, a small folding table, a few packed boxes stacked neatly in the corner. The place wasn't furnished, but it wasn't empty either. Jordan walked over to a wooden desk near the window and picked up a folder. He handed it to the older officer, who opened it and began flipping through the documents. Karen could barely contain her disbelief. This isn't possible," she muttered. "Samuel Matthews didn't have any children. I never saw anyone visit him. He lived alone." Jordan turned his head slightly, giving her a look that wasn't quite angry, but wasn't amused either. "He did live alone," he said. "By choice." Karen's mouth opened, but for once she had nothing to say. The older officer cleared his throat. "This is a deed transfer," he confirmed, flipping to the last page. "It's legally signed over to you, Jordan." The younger officer nodded, glancing at the signature. "And it looks like the paperwork was processed about 3 months ago. This is legit." Karen's mind spun. She had been so sure, so certain that this man had no business being here. And now? Now she was standing in his home, the very place she had tried to have him removed from. Her face burned with embarrassment, but she wasn't ready to back down just yet. "Well, even if you do own the house," she said stiffly, "you can't just let it sit like this. It's bringing down the value of the neighborhood. We have HOA rules." Jordan let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh. "HOA rules?" He shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. "Let me guess. You're the president?" Karen straightened her posture. "I'm on the board," she corrected, "and I take Maplewood Estates' standards very seriously." Jordan gave her a long, unreadable look before turning to the officers. "Am I free to go, or do I need to prove anything else?" The older officer handed back the folder. "You're all good," he said. "Sorry for the trouble, Mr. Matthews." Karen bristled at the polite tone. "Mr. Matthews? Just minutes ago they were ready to arrest him, and now they were acting like she was the problem?" Jordan walked them to the door, but before they left, he turned back to Karen. "I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood," he said, his tone measured. "But next time, maybe try knocking before calling the cops on the homeowner." Karen clenched her jaw as he shut the door. Karen stood outside the house, her face burning with frustration and embarrassment. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The officers had left without even giving Jordan so much as a warning, and now she was standing on the sidewalk, fuming, while he was inside his house, when just an hour ago she had been certain he didn't belong there at all. The worst part was that the other neighbors had seen the whole thing unfold. A few had watched from their porches, pretending to be busy with their potted plants or mailboxes, but Karen knew better. The news would spread. By tomorrow, half of Maplewood Estates would be whispering about how Karen Simmons called the cops on a man in his own home. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She turned back to the house and clenched her fists. No, she wasn't about to let this go. Fine, maybe he was the legal owner. But that didn't change the fact that his presence, his scruffy clothes, his lack of upkeep, was a problem. Maplewood Estates was known for its clean, picture-perfect streets. If Jordan Matthews thought he could let this house turn into an eyesore, he had another thing coming. Determined, she marched back up the steps and knocked sharply on the door. There was a pause before it swung open. Jordan stood there, arms crossed, looking at her with mild amusement. "You again," he said. Karen ignored his tone. "We need to talk." Jordan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I have a feeling I know where this is going. HOA regulations state that all homes must maintain a clean and respectable appearance," Karen said, standing as tall as she could, "which means you can't just let this house sit in disrepair. The lawn needs to be maintained, the exterior painted if necessary, and any visible clutter removed. If you intend to live here, you need to follow the rules like everyone else." Jordan studied her for a long moment before leaning against the doorframe. "You know," he said, "I've been in this house for weeks, and not once have you, or anyone else, knocked on my door to introduce yourselves. But the second you think I don't belong here, you call the cops on me. And now that you know I do belong, your first instinct is to start throwing rules at me?" Karen stiffened. "It's not personal. This is about maintaining standards." Jordan let out a dry laugh. "Right, standards." He shook his head. "You don't care about the house. You just don't like that I live in it." Karen felt her face flush. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Jordan pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer. "Because I've seen the way you look at me. You saw a guy in old clothes sitting on the steps, and instead of talking to me like a neighbor, you called the police." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Jordan sighed. "Look, I do plan on fixing up the house. It was my dad's, and it means a lot to me. But I don't owe you an explanation." With that, he shut the door in her face. Karen stood on the porch, staring at the closed door in front of her. Her face was hot, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not like that. Jordan Matthews acted like she was the problem when all she had done was try to protect the neighborhood. With a huff, she turned on her heel and marched back down the steps. Fine. Let him be stubborn. Let him live in that half-empty house with his dust-covered furniture and overgrown yard. But if he thought she was going to just stand by and let him ruin Maplewood Estates, he was wrong. She still had the HOA rules on her side. Over the next few days, Karen made it her mission to watch him closely. She took notes every time she passed by the house. The lawn was still unkempt. The paint on the shutters was peeling. He had been bringing in a few small pieces of furniture, but in her mind, it was not enough to justify the mess. She sent an official HOA notice about property upkeep and waited for a response. None came. Then, to her horror, some of the other neighbors started talking to him. She saw Mrs. Andrews from down the street bring over a plate of cookies. A few days later, Mr. Larson, the retired veteran, stood on Jordan's porch, shaking his hand like they were old friends. Even the teenage boy from next door had stopped by, carrying a toolbox, and later, she spotted them working together to fix something in the garage. Karen's frustration grew with every passing day. Why were they being so welcoming? Hadn't they all agreed on standards? Didn't they understand that once one house slipped, the rest of the neighborhood would follow? Then, one evening as she walked past 108 Birchwood Drive, she noticed something different. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow on the freshly swept steps. The grass had been trimmed, and a new mailbox stood where the old rusted one had been. Through the window, she could see warm light spilling from inside, casting shadows of furniture that hadn't been there before. Jordan was sitting on the porch, sipping a drink from a chipped mug. She hesitated, but kept walking. "Hey, Karen." She froze. He had never addressed her so casually before. Slowly, she turned. Jordan leaned back in his chair. "You're welcome to sit." She wanted to refuse, but something about his tone caught her off guard. After a brief hesitation, she stepped onto the porch and sat stiffly on the bench beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. "I get it," Jordan finally said. "You care about this place. You've spent years making sure it looks the way you think it should." He took a sip from his mug. "But you never stop to think about who lives here. A neighborhood isn't just about clean lawns and matching fences. It's about people." Karen swallowed, staring at her hands. "I'm not here to ruin anything," he continued. "This house was my dad's. And no, we weren't close. But it's mine now, and I do plan on making it a home." He glanced at her. "I just don't need your permission to do it." Karen exhaled slowly. Maybe she had been wrong. Not about everything, but about something. She had been so caught up in keeping Maplewood Estates exactly as it had always been that she hadn't considered that change didn't always mean decline. Finally, she stood up. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "if you need any recommendations for painters, I have a list." Jordan smirked. "I'll keep that in mind." As she walked away, she realized she wasn't nearly as angry as she had been. Maybe things wouldn't be exactly how she wanted them. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing.